Thank you. Welcome to the 12th SCB Emerging Issues in Conservation Seminar of 2021. My name is Martin Strauss. I'm a senior lecturer in the Nature Conservation Program at the University of South Africa. I'm also an associate editor of Conservation Science and Practice, and it is in this capacity that I've been organizing the series during 2021. So just briefly about the series. In the seminar series, we feature articles recently accepted, recently online, or recently published in the 3 SCB journals, being Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and of course, Conservation Science and Practice. Our seminars are always on a Wednesday, and I would like to encourage you to have a look on the SCB website for the interesting seminars that we have lined up for the rest of May and through June. June promises to be a bumper month for the seminar series, as we've got 5 Wednesdays in June. So before I introduce the speaker, just admit some more people. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to remind you that the seminar is being recorded so that those who could not join us today can access it later, or you can access it later on the SCB Vimeo channel. During the seminar, you are welcome to post any questions that you have or comments about the presentation in the chat. And then at the end of the seminar, which should be about 35 minutes or thereabouts, there will be ample time for questions, and you can also ask your questions live to our presenter today. So let me just admit a few more. Sorry. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Carlos Carrol. Carlos is an ecologist with the Klamath Center for Conservation Research in Orleans, California. His research focuses on habitat, viability, and connectivity modeling for a diverse group of threatened and endangered species, ranging from large carnivores to rare and endemic plant species. Carlos also leads the Adapt West Climate Adaptation Planning Project. And with that, Carlos, I'm going to hand over to you. And yeah, I'll reactivate my camera again on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And I'd like to thank the Society for Conservation Biology and its journals, Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, Conservation Science and Practice, for organizing this series. I've viewed some of the previous webinars, and they're quite a great resource. As Martin mentioned, I'm based at the Klamath Center for Conservation Research, which is in the Klamath bioregion of Northern California. This is also the traditional territory of the Karuk tribe. The impetus for Martin inviting me to present this webinar was a paper that I published with Reed Noss about a year ago in Conservation Biology called Rewilding in the Face of Climate Change. But today I'm going to also reference a number of other papers that myself and collaborators have published over the last few years, including some in the journal Conservation Letters. And all of the references that I will mention today are available from download at this link, tinyurl.com, Rewilding Webinar. I'd like to acknowledge the host of collaborators, some of them listed here. Adapt West is a binational research group focusing on climate adaptation, and in that capacity I work with researchers from a number of universities and government agencies. So as conservation biologists, we're very aware that we're focusing, a lot of our work focuses on 2 major crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. We're going through what's been called the 6th global extinction event, and we're increasingly projected to see temperatures that have not been characteristic of the Earth for the past several million years. So those 2 crises are being addressed at the international level, in part from the scientific community through global organizations such as IPCC and IPBES. And the primary global treaty that focuses on stemming biodiversity loss on biological diversity, which has been signed by almost all the countries in the world, almost 200. And every 10 years, the signatories meet together. The next meeting is in Kunming, China later this year, to update the global targets and indicators for addressing and tracking the response to halting biodiversity loss. So this will, what will be agreed on later this year in Kunming, China is called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And it embodies the 3 goals of the CBD, which are conserving nature, using it sustainably, and sharing its benefits equitably. Those global agreed on targets then filter down to the national level. For example, Canada, as a CBD signatory, has developed a number of targets such as Target 1 that are their response to their commitments under the CBD. The response to the climate crisis is addressed via other international fora, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But increasingly, scientists have called for a coordinated response to both the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. For example, a paper by Bernstein and colleagues a couple of years ago proposed to protect 30% of the Earth to stem biodiversity loss and designate an additional 20% of the planet as climate stabilization areas. And the rationale for that is that it's been projected that about 30% of our society's response to halting climate emissions will come from changes in land use. Currently, global land use, deforestation, and other factors is a source of warming, but with proper conservation actions and restoration, it could turn into a global carbon sink. And that contribution from is critical to getting us below these thresholds. So it's important to remember that all of these proposed percentages, for example, protect 30%, 17%, 50% of the planet, are only as useful as as to their effect in addressing these 2 crises. The idea being that area-based targets are an approximate sense of how much we might need to protect. If we have information on what are the most important sites for biodiversity and ecosystem carbon, and we take action to protect and conserve those areas, then we'll see improvements in some of these biodiversity and indicators. And if we don't, then we can circle back and revise some of our area-based targets and information. So in theory, these percentage targets and the suite of biodiversity indicators are integrated in a single framework. But as Nina Bola and colleagues pointed out in a review last year in Conservation Biology, we actually see in practice those perspectives are somewhat divergent. This is a great paper, and also Nina has put together a webinar in this series that occurred a few weeks ago, but you can view the recording on our channel. But unfortunately, to some extent, the what's called the Aichi Plus perspective, which focuses on a fairly complex suite of indicators for different scales of biodiversity, has not been well linked to some of these calls for large percentages of the planet. And of course, there are a number of researchers and practitioners that are working to address this. But I think Nina and colleagues were correct in identifying the further need to think through how we can unify these perspectives. Now, these calls to protect large percentages of the landscape are not new. Victor Shelford, a president of Ecological Society of America and founder of what became the Nature Conservancy, was calling for this many years ago. Much of our focus on the importance of large core areas and connectivity arise in papers such as that of Jared Diamond in 1975. He used the theory of island biogeography to distill 5 principles for reserve design. Basic principles such as a large compact reserve is better than fragmented reserves, and that connectivity can increase the effective size of reserve networks. A couple of decades later, Michael Soule, a co-founder of the field of conservation biology, along with Reid Noss, published a paper coining the term rewilding and distilling these principles down into what they called the 3 C's, which was a focus on cores, corridors, and carnivores. So basically what Soule and Noss were proposing was restoration and protection of interconnected wilderness landscapes that were large enough to support even the most area-dependent species such as large carnivores. And rewilding forms part of larger fields such as restoration ecology and conservation planning, but it's unique in terms of its focus on restoring processes at scale to an extent that we would have self-sustaining wilderness landscapes with complete food webs, natural disturbance regimes, so the landscape processes and ecosystem services could persist with minimal human intervention. In the subsequent 2 decades since Sule and Nos described rewilding, the term has evolved. In the European context, it primarily focuses on reintroduction of native herbivores such as the European bison and how that can help restore ecosystems. And often, due to the landscape context in Europe, the level of human intervention is greater than might be seen in North America. Carver and colleagues in a very recent review in conservation biology unified these different uses of the word rewilding, and they defined rewilding as sitting on a continuum of scale, connectivity, and level of human influence. But all of these definitions aim to restore ecosystem structure and functions to achieve a self-sustaining autonomous nature. And I think in addition to being a scientific concept with its roots in earlier writers, rewilding has also become something of a inspiration for conservation work and beyond. The first of proposed mega linkage was Yellowstone to Yukon in Western North America that extended from Yellowstone in the Western US up to northernmost Canada. There have been many more such linkage areas proposed and implemented in different parts of the world in the subsequent decades. And just this year in 2021, the first World Rewilding Day was announced to celebrate some of these accomplishments around the world. But as we think about some of the roots of rewilding, we also need to look at the construct of wilderness and wildness in the context, especially of North American conservation. Although Ed Abbey has famously said the idea of wilderness needs no defense, it only needs defenders, there's increasing recognition that wilderness concepts in the North American context at least have problematic roots to some extent. As some have said, they have colonial and racist elements. And this has been highlighted by recent publications such as that of Ellis and colleagues this year, showing that more than 70% of the globe has had some level of human habitation and use for at least the last 12,000 years. So I think increasingly over the last few years, we've seen a synthesis come out of these divergent perspectives that results in a more equitable and inclusive vision of rewilding. As Deb Haaland has recently said, she's the first Indigenous cabinet secretary in the history of the United States. We can be good stewards of these sacred landscapes. And I think all traditional cultures have had sacred landscapes, and even Thoreau in some of his later writings wrote, "It is vain to dream of a wildness distant from ourselves." So in North America and Australia and other parts of the world, we're increasingly Indigenous peoples take the forefront of efforts to expand the protected area network. For example, a few examples on the western coast of North America and British Columbia, the Kitanyao have proposed a new protected area to protect salmon spawning areas in their traditional territory from the climate change. And they are moving forward with implementing that area in the face of opposition from the province. Similarly, in the Western United States, a coalition of 5 tribes has formed the Bears Ears Coalition and has been advocating and proposing a large national monument in Utah. More generally, we see the support by federal and subnational governments for programs like Land Guardians that build capacity within Indigenous nations to manage and interpret wild landscapes to the larger society. If you want to learn more about this concept, which I only can touch on briefly today, there was a great webinar yesterday sponsored by the Narwhal that you can view a recording of about Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada. I encourage you to learn more at that link. Shifting back to some of the ecological challenges to the concept of rewilding, when Soule and Noss originally defined the term, they were aware of climate change, but there was a lot less information on it than there is today. Subsequently, authors such as Miguel Araujo in 2009 pointed those reserve design principles may become less relevant in the context of climate change. For example, small dispersed reserves or long narrow reserves might in some contexts be more effective at capturing environmental gradients and sustaining species under climate change than would a large compact reserve. So in our paper in conservation biology last year, we looked at some of the key principles of rewilding and investigated whether climate change invalidated them or suggested a more updated definition. For example, the principle that bigger is better in terms of large core areas versus many small reserves. Critiques by Araujo and others are relevant, but we also know that viable carnivore populations and those of other area-dependent species may help buffer the effects of climate change on species. For example, wolves in Yellowstone that increase the seasonal availability of carnivores, of carrion for other carnivores. And in the end, we feel that a multi-scale network of protected areas that includes both what's called micro and macro refugia is increasingly necessary under climate change. It's also been mentioned that maybe long, narrow reserves are more important than minimizing edge in reserve design. But we know that some edge effects, such as effect of drought and fire on old forest ecosystems, could be accentuated under climate change. So I think although considering the need to capture climatic gradients, we also need to focus on ameliorating some of these increased edge effects, which suggests that large reserves will still provide this important benefit. Although for some species, assisted colonization is the only practical solution for allowing them to persist under climate change. In other words, humans moving them from their current habitat to newly suitable habitat. For many others, connectivity will still play an important role in order allowing them to track climate as it shifts across the Earth's surface. This is especially important for coastal species as their habitat is lost to sea level rise. Finally, we acknowledge that the rewilding's focus on restoring ecosystem processes becomes more complex under climate change because historical baselines may be less relevant. But we also know that restoration of ecosystem processes is one tool to increase ecosystem resilience to climatic stressors. For example, prescribed fire and return of frequent low intensity fire may make forest ecosystems more resilient to large-scale severe fire disturbance. So in the end, we said that rather than tossing out the rewilding phrase, add climate resilience to the previous 3 C's and retain some of the focus on protecting and representing landscape types, environmental gradients, but add an additional focus on protecting climate refugia and climate corridors. And this observation isn't novel. For example, Laura Correstein's review of Canada's Pathway to Target 1 focused in part on protecting connectivity and refugia. And in fact, the official Canadian advisory report on how to expand the protected area network also mentioned aspects. We know that climate change refugia present a slow lane in which biodiversity can persist, at least temporarily, while human society hopefully addresses and reduces climate emissions, and then biodiversity could be maintained on the landscape and recolonize areas. This is a concept that Tony Morelli in a recent review paper has expanded upon. And as I mentioned, climate refugia, this is a broad concept that spans a range of spatial scales. Macro refugia are areas that we typically map with the broad continental scale data sets. They're broad areas of where climate is relatively stable. It's also important to note the role that topography and other factors plays in creating micro refugia, small areas of locally favorable environments within a broader unsuitable climate, and these be important especially for smaller species. So both in our review paper in 2017 and Deanna Strahlberg's paper from last year, we look at the range of scales at which different ecosystem processes can generate these refugia areas. Another way to look at this is in the lens of the CBD's post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which monitors gain or loss of biodiversity at three scales: that of ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity within species. Although we usually think of climate refugia in the context of individual species, you can actually develop refugia metrics at each of these scales of biodiversity, and we give more specifics in our recent paper that was out in the last couple of weeks. And it's important to recognize that our understanding of the complex ecological factors that generate and maintain refugia is perfect and evolving. We use fairly crude models to represent these. Some of these models are based just on climate projections. Some of them add information on species distributions, and others, such as the microrefugia models that I discussed, just use elevation data without any information about future climate. We can also, of course, increasingly access data sets showing the distribution of above ground and below ground ecosystem carbon at these broad extents as well. The concept of climate connectivity areas or climate corridors may be less familiar than the concept of climate refugia, but important. Many species we know may not be able to persist in the exact location they inhabit today, but if there is newly suitable habitat relatively close by and connected to their current habitat, they do have the ability to shift and disperse to this new habitat. Often these will try to avoid hostile climates, like perhaps the hot low elevation areas in a valley shown on the left here. So they'll take a more circuitous route that will stay within suitable climates. So in recent papers, we've tried to map these paths and identify important climate corridors. On the right, some of these corridors up and down the Rocky Mountains of the Western United States and Canada. So Deanna Strahlberg, in a paper last year in Conservation Letters, overlaid all of these sources of information, different types of refugia, microrefugia corridors, and looked at the areas jumped out as high priorities for additional protection and conservation. And these are shown in blue in this map on the right. And you can see some of these areas are actually the focus of Indigenous protected area proposals currently in Western Canada. So this type of brush data set is no substitute for local information, but it does help contextualize some of the local initiatives. And in addition to these types of quantitative overlays of spatial data, it's important that practitioners understand some of the qualitatively some of the geographic patterns that are created by the forces that create climate refugia, typically global climate systems as they interact with local topography. For example, in the Yellowstone to Yukon area that we used as an example in our paper last year, you can see a strong latitudinal gradient as climate change intensifies in boreal regions. Species richness decreases, as well as the human footprint, but below ground carbon increases. And similarly, longitudinal patterns as the global climate jet stream intersects with these north-south mountain ranges, you get gradients in precipitation and species above ground carbon, as well as patterns as you move from lower to higher elevations. So if you're a conservation practitioner or planner looking at the protected area network in Yellowstone to Yukon, looking at a composite fingerprint of all of these different types of metrics, perhaps laid in this type of star plot that we show here, can help you understand the context of how these different protected areas contribute to the overall resilience of the network. Here we see, as one might expect, that the protected areas in the south provide more value as species refugia, but as you move north, you get more below ground carbon, intact habitat for species dependent on that type of habitat. So it's important to understand how different protected areas embody different aspects of climate resilience. And it's also, although we don't display the data here, it's also important to recognize other ecosystem processes are generating refugia. For example, topography or other factors may create areas called fire refugia that burn less frequently or less severely than the broader landscape. And also there may be refugia from insect outbreaks or drought, refugia created by peatlands, lake shores, coastal areas. So I encourage you to refer to some of the other reviews mentioned here for more information on that. The type of broad extent spatial data that we are talking about here and that we've developed it is useful as a first broad brush look at where we might find areas that could help us meet both biodiversity and climate goals. So in this map, we show in purple areas that are classified as for high and irrecoverable ecosystem as well as climate refugia. And you can see that those areas occur commonly in boreal peatlands and as well as in mesic older forests of the Pacific coast and southeast United States. So that is a way that hopefully and local collaborators, tribes can unify their work to address both climate and their commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So goals like Protect 30 by 30 will be more than just an accounting measure. There will actually be an effective response to these crises. And I haven't touched at length on the role of protecting irrecoverable ecosystem carbon, but there have been a number of recent reviews showing how protecting these peatlands and older forests are key elements in terms of our getting us to climate neutrality and complementing efforts at fossil fuel. So once again, as I mentioned before, these types of data that I've discussed, as well as other data sets, can help us identify what areas might be priorities for conservation efforts. And in combination with area-based targets and local knowledge can help motivate actions. But we have to also have a robust framework of indicators that can track whether our actions are actually having the effect of reducing biodiversity loss and carbon emissions from land use. But the area-based targets like 30% have been key in incentivizing these ambitious efforts by nations and local collaborators. And they do provide great opportunities for focusing on climate refugia, carbon, as well as the many other aspects of importance in creating protected areas. In our recent paper, we use an example from the Yukon in Northwest Canada. For example, the Peel watershed shown in green here. Local First Nations collaborated with provincial and national governments to agree on a land use plan or a land relationship plan, better called, that would designate 83% of the watershed in some form of conservation management. There have been additional examples in the Northwest Territories, and all of this has been coordinated by a national report by the Indigenous Circle of Experts on how these area-based targets can be in the context of reconciliation. So I think Canada's and First Nations there are really at the forefront of this new model of protected area network planning. The US is coming somewhat later to this effort, but has now, under the also committed to protecting 30 by 30. So in our recent paper, we look at the role that different federal and state agencies, tribal governments, as well as support for conservation management on agricultural lands and private easements can play complementary roles in getting us to by 30, as well as halting biodiversity loss and carbon emissions. In the US context, many of the most promising frameworks for this type of planning occur in a response to listing of threatened species, such as the northern spotted owl in the northwestern US, triggered a multi-agency plan called the Northwest Forest Plan. This plan is now being updated after a couple of decades, and there have been calls for it to also address protection of climate refugia and carbon as well. So other examples in the US context are the sage grouse conservation plan, as well as the various renewable energy conservation plans that strive to site areas such as solar panels in a way that's consistent with maintained biodiversity. So I think there are a number of existing policy mechanisms that we describe in this recent paper, as well as novel ones such as being trialed by First Nations in Canada that we have to look for, because we're going to need all of these tools to achieve these kind of ambitious goals. And the CBD framework recognizes that not all of the areas that will by 30 will be strictly protected. There's a role for areas that are managed under conservation, other effective conservation measures, but also may be providing productive land uses for human society as well. And there have been a couple of recent papers that have looked at how you can management strategies based on the level of climate vulnerability and the level of protection that are assigned to an area. But lastly, I think one of the key elements of actually meeting these ambitious goals is building what's called communities of practice. And these are networks of researchers, practitioners that can integrate various ways of knowing, traditional ecological knowledge, Western science, and work together to build local initiatives to propose and implement and manage protected areas and other conservation areas. So a key mechanism for this in the United States and Canada in previous years has been the Landscape Conservation Cooperative Network. In the US, this was dismantled under the previous federal administration, but we're hopeful that it will be revitalized in the coming years, because we really need more of these opportunities for convenings and communities of practice. I'd like to end by pointing you back to our Adapt West website, which has a lot of the data sets that I've discussed today, freely downloadable. And also, if you want to explore some of the information, view and download a report for a protected area or watershed anywhere in North America, that we have a web app at the same database and site that's developed in collaboration with Justin Beckers of NRCan that allows you to do that. So I'd encourage you to check out the app as well. You can also follow us on Twitter. And lastly, I'd remind all of the papers that we discussed today are available for download. The full references at this URL, tinyurl.com rewilding webinar. So I look forward to questions from the webinar participants, and I thank you for listening.
Carlos, thank you very much. So I think we can open the floor for questions. I don't see anything in the chat, but if you have a question and you're ready to fire, you can unmute yourself and ask Carlos directly.
Hi, Martin. This is Claudia from Germany.
Hi, Claudia.
The chat has been inactivated again, so it's not possible to write anything. At least it is in my chat. Yeah. And thanks to Carol for the exciting presentation. Not that I have grasped everything, but just a question: how do you know which way to go? Because while we are managing wildlife and wild habitats, sort of evolution is ongoing. How can we know which way evolution actually wants to go, apart from human influence? And if we sort of support actual evolution in the way of rewilding, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that is a question that I am certainly aware of. I don't have any great wisdom to add, but it's I would say the evolutionary potential of most species is poorly known. There's an increasing amount of research on it. We know that some species, for example, from North America, I think of the wolverine as the classic species that does not seem to adapt easily to human presence in landscapes. You can, for example, you can look at the brown bear and wolf in Europe, where it seems to, populations seem to be much more tolerant of sharing the landscape with humans than we've seen in North America, and some of that may be an adaptive response. And of course, going down to more species, there's a number of other elements of their niche that are primarily unknown, but there's efforts to evaluate that and experiment with assisted migration. But yeah, I think that's a key question, and I think that we can assume that we're not aware of the full adaptive potential of most species, but to assume that they can adapt to some of the intense and rapid changes that we're causing on the landscape, especially with climate change, I don't think we can assume that either. So that's not a detailed answer, but I would be interested in learning more about that as well.
Thank you, and I have to apologize. I called you by a wrong name. Your first name is Carlos, so I apologize. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Thanks.
Carlos, while we wait for somebody in the audience to come with another question, in the paper you pointed to Bhutan and Canada, and now in the talk to the USA as well, that are really ambitious plans in the case of Canada and the USA, and things that have already been done in Bhutan, where I think in the paper you said they've conserved 42% of their land area. I fear for many, if not most countries, that kind of commitment to 30% by 2030, conserving 30% of land by 2030 is out of reach. So I was glad to see that you mentioned there's also other mechanisms that can be used. And part of my question initially was whether you think something like the man and biosphere approach would be something that could fit into this to get to that 30%, or at least greater percentages than what we have at the moment.
I think that that's going to be a major topic of discussion and negotiation CBD meetings in Kunming, what actually counts towards some of these ambitious targets like 30%. It's imperative, and I think there'll be a lot of voices at Kunming making the point that you do, that the 30% needs to encompass conservation initiatives locally led that allow traditional uses of the landscape. That has to be balanced with the fact the governments are, including I would say the US and Canada, are tempted to use this as more of an accounting measure and include land categories that do not effectively contribute to the overarching biodiversity goals. So I think that there needs to be a flexible framework, but some standards for guiding and informing local efforts, and allowing us to track what broad and innovative range of conservation and management tools, what of that is actually contributing to the biodiversity goals, and what is not effective. So yeah, I think that's a key question that especially in more heavily populated areas of the Europe and Asia, and really globally, it's going to be a key question.
Thank you. Then I have a question in the chat here from Emily Antunes that says, thank you for a great presentation, Carlos. My question is, who determines the scale and baselines for a rewilding project? And should these projects worry about sample size and pseudo-replication?
I missed part of that. The scale of the Adapt West project, is that what?
Who determines the scale and baselines for a rewilding project?
Oh, for a rewilding project. Yeah, I think that's in the context of trying to test efficacy of rewilding in a conservation biology context. And certainly, yeah, I mean, my co-author Reid Noss has written about how rewilding projects can be successful at a range of scales. Many landscapes cannot support some of the most area-dependent carnivores, so the needs of smaller focal species can guide some of the principles of reserve design. I think it's quite challenging to assess restoration of ecosystem processes when a rewilding project is of fairly limited spatial extent. And that's gets back to your previous question as to the relevance of rewilding outside of the landscapes such as in the boreal, where you have the possibility of creating or retaining these large intact landscapes. So I think the European application of rewilding has been investigating some of these questions more deeply than I have had a chance to, but it's certainly challenging. I mean, even in the United States, if you're trying to restore, for example, natural fire regimes, that comes into conflict with exurban development, housing, etc. So it's often very challenging to do this, and an active area of research.
Okay. I have a couple of more questions in the chat, but let's just see if there's perhaps somebody who'd like to ask a question in person before I go to the next one in the chat. Okay, then if we go back to the chat, there's a question from Craig Miller. And he asks, how is climate-induced human migration, presumably towards climate-resilient areas and associated increased pressures and impacts on protected areas, most effectively accounted for in modeling?
I admit that some of our collaborators, such as Josh Lawler at the University of Washington and his lab researchers, have looked at that. There's also great work being done in the Yellowstone ecosystem by Ray Rasker and others. I myself have not delved into that. I'm just aware of research, and of course, modeling human society's response to an uncertain future sort of exponentially increases the amount of uncertainty, but we can already see some of these trends just in response to the pandemic and climate change. We see explosion of population growth in areas of the rural western US that are close to national parks, such as in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So that has, if not planned and managed correctly, type of housing growth has huge effects on connectivity and biodiversity. So I think we can't avoid looking at that, but it's not a specific focus of my research.
Thank you. I have another one from Claudia, who decided to type the question that she says might be at a bit of a tangent. And she asks, are there lessons we might derive at a large scale from wildlife utilization of landscapes under COVID? In other words, connectivity considerations in landscapes where human activity has been dampened.
I know of a couple of research groups that are looking at that. Some of them who have published high-profile review papers on human impacts and the human footprint worldwide and responsive species to that have used the opportunity, unfortunately, provided by the pandemic to look at wildlife response to reduced visitation of wild areas. Of course, at least in North America, shortly after the initial lockdowns, we saw a huge rebound of human use of wild lands in response to the lack of opportunities in more urban settings. Perhaps a better, at least experimental opportunity is provided in the ocean, where the loss of scheduling of cruise lines quieted the seascape and allowed species that are sensitive to acoustic disturbance to reuse traditional migrant pathways. So I think that's fascinating as well. But yeah, I look forward to some of that research coming out in the next couple of years.
Thank you. And I should just point out that that was not a question by Claudia Schuner, but by Fiona Schmigelo. We have another question here from Armando Bastos. And she says there are strong opinions on which 30% is the right 30%. Biodiversity hotspots do not occur at latitudinal extremes. Do you think rewilding of the latter areas has an important role to play in compensating for the suboptimal 30% and perhaps driving initiatives to increase to more than 30%?
Could you repeat the first part of it? I didn't. So biodiversity hotspots are not found
at the
what was
the latitudinal extremes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that builds on a point that I made in this webinar, in that there's the historic dichotomy between the so-called hotspot and cold spot strategies in conservation biology. And we've, of course, seen many publications focusing on the megadiverse hotspot areas. Increasingly, there's additional focus on some of these areas that, for which they've been called cold spots, but they're better seen as opportunities for a large intact landscape conservation, many of which, at least in the northern hemisphere, are key storehouses of below ground carbon. So I think they provide many biodiversity benefits. They're not as speciose as lower latitude areas, but they are a key necessary ingredient in ecosystem carbon conservation. So I think that you need additional rationale to get governments to focus on these areas. I think that provides a strong rationale for that.
Thank you. I also have a question from David Lux. How does fragmentation, measured in terms of existing and proposed roads, affect quality and utility of conserved areas? This is the nub of conservation questions in the Yukon and elsewhere in the north.
Well, I think there's been a lot of recent work by other researchers improving our information on some of these linear features in the landscape. Of course, it's not just roads, but seismic exploration lines, a number of, especially in the Arctic, these disturbances may seem temporary, but they often are very long after effects. And roads can be characterized by the extent that they're growth inducing, and it may not be the initial road, but rather the follow-on development that occurs. And of course, we see that throughout the globe. So I think that there's a lot of work. Fiona Schmigelo, who asked an earlier question, her research into this, and yeah, it causes us to look more carefully at some of these approval of some of these projects that may seem, a road may seem in isolation to have minimal impact on the larger landscape. Is a majority of it is intact, but we now know that the cumulative effects of these disturbances may be more than initially meets the eye.
Thank you. Yes, I also have another question for you. In the paper, you made reference to climate velocity and the rate at which species need to move to be able to follow, let's say, the climatic envelope. A general Oh, and you also refer to assisted colonization as one way where that connectivity is broken to get species into the right places. A general adage in wildlife management is that the smaller the area, the more intensively you have to manage it. Do you foresee perhaps that due to differential climate velocities in an ecosystem, that we are potentially have to start considering more intensive management even of large conservation areas?
Well, yeah, I think that principle still holds, but you know, over the last few decades, I'm thinking of the early book, The End of Nature. The point was made that climate change means that there are no unimpacted landscapes anywhere on the globe, if there ever were. But so I think two elements of that. We do have to carefully consider a broader suite of management strategies within reserves. And I know that the national park agencies in both are considering that, but that always has to be compatible with the overall goals of biodiversity conservation, and also cognizant of how little we know about some of these management interventions, such as assisted migration, but also the point that microrefugia and their conservation, we may increasingly need to be aware of and conserve these smaller areas on the landscape, even within so-called production landscapes. For example, the forestry areas may need to avoid timber harvest in areas that might be. So I think that there's a range of scales, and climate change certainly alters our ground rules on what level of and what type of management is appropriate.
Thank you. I have a couple more in the chat, but is there anybody who would like to ask Carlos a question directly? If so, you can just unmute and go. Okay, then I do have another question from Claudia Schuner. In order to reduce carbon emissions, what are your thoughts about nuclear energy plants?
Well, I personally, I mean, this is not something that I have scientific expertise on, so it's just my comment as a US citizen. I think the cost of renewables has been decreasing so rapidly that there will be some role for existing nuclear plants in as a bridge fuel, but I think over the coming decades, decrease in cost and increasing capacity of battery storage as well. I think that generalizations as to the extent that nuclear power would need to play in the energy mix, we're having to rethink those. So that's just my sort of somewhat informed opinion as a citizen.
Thank you. I have another one for you, and that is that in the paper and in the presentation, you highlighted the importance of including micro and macro refugia within the conservation network. But you also highlighted some previous work that pointed out that micro refugia often are so-called stepping stone habitats, and that we really need robust conservation networks. So it seems to me that perhaps an early step that most countries need to do is to assess robustness of existing conservation networks. Is there a standardized way of assessing that robustness?
I think that what I mentioned is called the Global Biodiversity Framework, to be agreed on in October in Kunming. There's been a huge amount of research over the past few years trying to develop information that can support that framework. The framework has gone through a number of iterations. Our reason for publishing, especially our paper that came out just a week or two ago, was the relative lack of attention being paid to climate resilience in the GBF to date. So we're hoping that some of the information we develop can help inform this evolution of the standards. But I'd say that at a global level, that framework will provide the best opportunity for developing these types of standards and indicators. But it's very challenging. It's often pointed out that there's no single metric of biodiversity status and trend that's similar to 1.5 or 2 degrees global warming. So we're trying to monitor and improve the status of a very complex set of ecological processes, and along with making the benefits of biodiversity more equitably available to human society. So yeah, I don't think that we're there yet, but I see that as the effort that offers the most promise.
Okay, thank you. Then I have one more question in the chat here, and that's again from Emily Antunes. Has legislation around wildlife trade, critical habitat protection, endangered species, etc., impacted conservation and restoration efforts?
Well, the US was the first to have a powerful statute in this respect in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, and subsequently many countries around the world have enacted endangered species statutes. If I understand correctly, yes, we describe in our recent paper a lot of opportunities provided by the policy processes that are linked to these statutes. I think that that also occurs in, for example, the context of the European Union. Some of the mandates, habitat protection there. I think agencies are working to try to update their policy around endangered species recovery to incorporate some of these new perspectives on climate and as well as carbon. So I think that there's a lot of work being done in that area.
Thank you, Carlos. If we can maybe fit one more in quickly that just come through. And this is from Katarzyna Nowak. Do you think that North American countries may become signatories to the Convention on Migratory Species?
Well, I think the US and the Vatican are the only non-signatories of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So certainly as a US citizen, I would advocate, and many other organizations advocate, that the US become a signatory. Unfortunately, as we discussed, our system of governance tends to erect very high barriers you need a supermajority to ratify a treaty. So a number of international treaties like Law of the Sea and others, even the climate treaties are not subject to ratification in the US. So I would like to see this happen. I recognize the barriers to it. To some extent, we can hope that US policymakers will work to implement the targets of the CBD, even without being formal use to the treaty itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos, and thanks everyone. I think with that we'll stop questions. And I would like to thank you, Carlos, for your time and for your willingness to come on air today and to present the seminar to us. I certainly found it interesting, and I do think that we've had some interesting questions posed to you. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Martin, for organizing this.
It's a pleasure. And then I would just like to remind everybody of our upcoming seminars. We don't have one scheduled for the 12th of May, but on the 19th of May, we have Dr. Bia Maas from the University of Vienna, and she will present on Women and Global South, strikingly underrepresented among top publishing ecologists. And that is a paper from Conservation Letters. So please also visit our website, the SCB website, where you can see a full schedule for the rest of the talks in May and in June. And with that, thank you very much and goodbye.